The morning sun hadn't even burned off the dew when Karen Chen first heard the noise. It wasn't the sound itself that bothered her, it was what the sound represented. The low rumble of a moving truck backing down Elm Street at 6:47 a.m. on a Saturday, the casual disregard for suburban peace, the audacity. Karen stood at her kitchen window, watching her new neighbors through the gap in her hydrangea bushes, her second espresso cooling in her hand. She'd lived on this street for 14 years. 14 years of maintaining her lawn to magazine standards. 14 years of never, ever playing music after 9 p.m. 14 years of being a model resident in a neighborhood that was supposed to be quiet. The new family was black. Karen wouldn't think about this fact until later, much later, when a therapist she'd reluctantly see would ask her to examine her assumptions. But standing there that Saturday morning, watching 3 generations of people carry furniture and laughter into the house directly across from hers, she simply felt a vague, unnamed dread. The kind that attaches itself to change. The father, tall with a belly that suggested he enjoyed life, directed traffic with the ease of a man comfortable being visible. The mother orchestrated the chaos with the precision of a general, calling out instructions. 2 teenage kids, a girl and a boy, moved boxes with the theatrical size of youth. And behind them, an older woman, the grandmother, sat on the porch steps watching it all with a serene smile. By 9 a.m., Karen had photographed the truck's license plate and written down arrival times. By noon, she'd already researched the family's credit rating through an online service that promised peace of mind for vigilant homeowners. By 2 p.m., she'd called the HOA president twice and left increasingly urgent voicemails. The truck didn't leave until 6 p.m., but Karen was already planning. 3 weeks later, Karen's preparations bore fruit. It started on a Saturday afternoon in late June. The weather was perfect, the kind of day that made people want to gather to celebrate, to be loud about their joy. The father, whose name Karen had learned was Marcus Williams, fired up a grill in his backyard at precisely 2:15 p.m. The smell hit Karen's house by 2:20. It wasn't the smell of charcoal and meat that offended her. It was the smoke that rose above the fence line, slightly visible from her upstairs window. It was a violation of the invisible boundaries that kept neighborhoods functioning. It was illegal, she was certain, though she'd need to check the municipal code. She checked the municipal code. According to subsection 1243, residential grilling was permitted only between the hours of 10 a.m. and 8 p.m., and only when smoke was minimally visible to adjacent properties. Karen had a screenshot of this on her phone within 5 minutes. But the grill wasn't the main event. Around 4 p.m., people started arriving. A sedan, an SUV, a truck with a cooler in the back, a station wagon that seemed to overflow with an extended family. By 5 p.m., there were at least 25 people in the Williams' backyard. Karen knew this because she'd counted them from her second-floor window, binoculars in hand, feeling like a natural history researcher documenting the mating habits of a particularly loud species. The music started at 5:30 p.m. It was funk, earth, wind, and fire, maybe, infectious, the kind of music designed to make bodies move, and move they did. Through the fence slats, Karen could see people dancing, actually dancing, in a residential neighborhood on a Saturday. The decibel level was, she estimated, approximately 87 dB. She knew this because she downloaded a sound level meter app. Karen had had enough. She called the non-emergency police line at 6:15 p.m., speaking in the careful, measured tones of someone who'd scripted this conversation. Hi, yes, I'm calling to report a noise violation and possible fire code violations at 447 Elm Street. There's a residential grill producing excessive smoke, and there's a gathering of approximately 30 people in a residential backyard creating unreasonable noise. The music is extremely loud. I have documentation. I'm very concerned about safety standards and neighborhood ordinances. The dispatcher, a 22-year-old named Marcus who had no patience for this particular flavor of complaint, assured her that an officer would arrive when available. Karen hung up satisfied, when available. That could mean 15 minutes or 2 hours, it didn't matter. The point was established. She was the one who cared about rules. She was the one maintaining standards. She poured herself a glass of Sauvignon Blanc and settled onto her porch to wait. At the Williams house, nobody knew that the evening was about to become a teaching moment. Marcus Williams, SR, was in his element. A successful mortgage broker turned weekend chef, wearing an apron that said "Some Dad Bod" in ironic letters. He was telling a story about a client who'd tried to lie about his income, and the relatives who'd come to celebrate his birthday were laughing with the kind of genuine delight that comes from people who actually like each other. His wife, Diane, was in the kitchen assembling potato salad while their daughter, Zoe, helped their son, Marcus Jr. set up more seating in the already crowded backyard. The grandmother, Marcus Sr. S. mother, Gloria, was teaching her great-grandnieces a step-in, dance she'd learned in 1987, and they were absolutely murdering the steps while laughing so hard they could barely breathe. The playlist was carefully curated. Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, Prince, The Temptations, current R&B artists who understood that groove was a language. The volume was appropriately festive without being disruptive. They'd kept an eye on the clock, checking it against their mental map of neighborhood dynamics. Diane had even suggested they keep the music down after 8 p.m. "Let's be respectful," she'd said, the phrase automatic, practiced, a safety protocol for existing while black in spaces where they might not be fully welcome. But for now, at 6:45 p.m. on a perfect June evening, surrounded by family who'd driven from 3 different cities to celebrate Marcus Sr.'s birthday, the Williams family and their guests were precisely in the middle of their joy. Then Marcus Jr. noticed the police car pulling up to the front of the house. Officer David Chen had been working the evening shift for 7 years. He was 43, had 2 kids of his own, and had heard approximately 6,000 noise complaints in his tenure, roughly 60% of which were bullshit. The call about the barbecue had come with that particular tone that suggested bullshit. A woman's voice, careful and measured, the kind of careful that suggested she'd been waiting for something to complain about. He'd taken his time responding, handling a few other calls first. By the time he rolled up to 447 Elm Street, it was 6:55 p.m. What he found was this: a backyard full of people eating barbecue, music playing at a level he could comfortably converse over, kids running around, an older woman teaching teenagers to dance, the smell of meat and joy and life happening exactly as it was supposed to happen on a Saturday evening in June. He sat in his car for a moment, watching. Then he thought about his own kids' birthday parties, his wife's family gatherings, the feeling of being in a space where you were wanted, where you were celebrated, where your existence was enough to merit a party. He also thought about the call, the measured tone, the documentation, the concern about fire codes and smoke drifting across property lines. David Chen had been doing this job long enough to recognize the sound of someone protecting something invisible. Some people had money to protect their neighborhoods. Some had time to learn ordinances. Some had the privilege of caring that much about the invisible boundary lines between themselves and their neighbors. He pulled into the driveway. Marcus Williams Sr. saw the police car first and felt the familiar contraction of anxiety that came from being a black man in a situation that could be misunderstood. He straightened his apron. He told the others without words, through a glance, a subtle shift in his posture, that they should remain calm. Officer Chen got out of his car, took his time walking toward the backyard gate, and did something that would echo through the neighborhood for months to come. He smiled. "Good evening," he said, stepping into the backyard. "I heard there might be a problem." Marcus Sr. immediately shifted into the careful politeness of a black man speaking to police. "Officer, we're just having a family birthday party we've been mindful about." "I'm going to need a burger," Officer Chen interrupted, still smiling. "Seriously, that smells incredible." The moment fractured, froze, then reformed into something entirely different. Karen, watching from her porch through binoculars, saw the officer arrive and felt a surge of vindication. Finally, someone who would understand, someone who would enforce the rules that she, Karen, had taken so much time and effort to research. She grabbed her phone, ready to provide the documentation she'd prepared. She watched as the officer walked to the backyard. She watched as he didn't write a ticket. She watched as he came back out 5 minutes later, carrying a plate of food and a beer. Karen's binoculars shook slightly in her hands. Officer David Chen had never planned to stay at the Williams barbecue for 3 hours. He'd gone in intending to assess the situation, maybe give a gentle advisory about keeping the music at reasonable levels, and move on with his shift. A simple noise complaint from a neighbor. These things were common, usually stemmed from genuine cultural misunderstandings, and could be resolved with a brief conversation about mutual respect. But when Marcus Williams SR handed him a paper plate loaded with ribs, cornbread, and collard greens, something shifted. "Come on, officer," Marcus said warmly. "We're not trying to cause trouble, we're just celebrating, but thank you for coming by to check on things." The food was exceptional. The kind of food that didn't come from any restaurant that required hours of planning, of care, of love. And the people around him, they were warm, welcoming, seemingly unsurprised that he'd accepted the plate. Like they'd been taught that hospitality transcended official roles, that a uniform didn't mean you couldn't also be human. Diane, his wife, asked him if he wanted a beer. Zoe asked if he had kids. The grandmother, Gloria, took one look at his face and said, "You look tired, baby." And just like that, Officer Chen found himself being absorbed into the celebration. He'd stayed because his shift wasn't urgent, because the other calls could wait a few minutes, because it had been a long time since anyone had treated him like he was fully human rather than a symbol, an enforcer, a representative of the system. And because somewhere around 7:30 p.m., when they started teaching him the step-in dance that Gloria had introduced, he'd felt something crack open inside his chest. His wife, Patricia, had been asking him to go to family gatherings more often, to be present, to remember that he existed in spaces beyond work. He'd been working so much, chasing promotions, chasing the idea that if he was good enough at his job, his kids would be safe, his family would be secure. But standing in this backyard learning dance moves from an 87-year-old woman while a teenager named Marcus Jr. whooped encouragement, he felt the falseness of that equation. By 8:30 p.m., Officer Chen had eaten 2 plates, taught Marcus Jr. a few police defensive techniques, which the kid found hilarious, and was genuinely laughing at Gloria's stories about meeting her husband at a speakeasy in 1968. At 8:45 p.m., the music shifted to something mellower. Marvin Gaye's "Let's Get It On." And he found himself on the porch with Diane, who was watching her family with the contentment of someone who'd built something real. "Your wife's lucky," she said. "Having you here, actually being present. My husband's worked so hard to provide for us that sometimes I think he forgets what we're providing for." David thought about Patricia, about missing his daughter's soccer games, about promising he'd be at his son's school presentation and canceling because of a case. "I'm working on that," he said quietly. "You're here now," Diane said. "That's something." Meanwhile, at 8 Elm Street, Karen Chen was experiencing the progressive stages of realization that something had gone wrong. Stage 1, confusion. The police officer was eating. Why was the police officer eating at the place where the noise violation was occurring? Stage 2, concern. Had she done something wrong? Had she misunderstood the ordinances? She looked them up again on her phone. No, the music was too loud. The gathering was too large. The smoke had been too visible. Stage 3, indignation. The officer was dancing. She could see him through the fence now, moving to music with these people, laughing. This was not appropriate police conduct. This was not. Stage 4, rage. She dialed the non-emergency line again. "Hi, yes, I need to report that the officer who was dispatched to my noise complaint is currently fraternizing with the offenders. He's eating at their party. This seems like a conflict of interest." The dispatcher, a different Marcus this time, equally disinterested, assured her that officers had discretion in how they responded to complaints, and that if there was no violation occurring, there was nothing to report. "But there is a violation." Karen could hear her own voice getting shrill. She lowered it carefully. "The music is too loud, there are too many people, there's excessive smoke." "Ma'am, if Officer Chen has assessed the situation and determined there's no violation, then there's no violation. You're welcome to file a formal complaint with the precinct, but..." Karen hung up. She sat on her porch, watching the police car in the driveway of 447 Elm Street, and felt something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just anger. It was a kind of abandonment, like she'd been following rules that everyone else had agreed didn't actually matter. At 10:15 p.m., Officer Chen finally left the Williams house. He'd stayed well past the end of his shift, and only the text from Patricia asking if he was working late or doing something else had pulled him back into awareness of time. As he walked to his car, Marcus SR walked him out, and they shook hands like old friends. "Thank you," Marcus said, and Officer Chen understood that the thanks encompassed much more than just not writing a ticket. It encompassed being seen, being treated like a neighbor instead of a threat. "Thank you," Officer Chen said back, meaning the food, the laughter, the reminder that he existed beyond his uniform. As he drove away from 447 Elm Street, Officer Chen found himself driving past 8 Elm Street, where a woman sat on her porch in the dark, watching him leave. He didn't acknowledge her. He didn't need to. But he understood in that moment that this situation had just acquired dimensions he hadn't anticipated. Karen didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, searching for information about her rights as a homeowner. She researched HOA enforcement. She looked up property values in neighborhoods with noise issues. She compiled documentation in a folder labeled 447M Evidence and organized it by date and time. At 2 a.m., she found herself on the Williams family's social media accounts. Their Facebook page was full of photos from previous gatherings, birthdays, graduations, Christmas celebrations. A family that apparently gathered frequently. A family that apparently made noise and played music and existed loudly and unapologetically in their own space. She should have felt more than she did. Looking back on this moment later, Karen would wish she'd felt something: shame, concern, the first stirring of conscience. But what she felt instead was clarification. This wasn't just about one party. This was about the trajectory. If they had one gathering a month, that was 12 noise violations a year. If they had one every 2 weeks, that was 26. If they treated their backyard like the entire neighborhood was their private concert venue. Her thoughts were interrupted by her own exhaustion. She went to bed at 3 a.m., and her sleep was violent, full of dreams about her property value declining, about the neighborhood changing, about losing control of something she'd spent 14 years maintaining. At 447 Elm Street, Officer David Chen's presence had been noted. The news traveled through the family like electricity. The police had come and stayed, had eaten with them, had been treated like a human being instead of a symbol. And by extension, the family had been treated like people deserving of that humanity, rather than as a problem to be managed. Marcus S.R. called his brother in Atlanta. Diane texted her mother in Oakland. The story grew as it traveled, became almost mythical, the officer who understood, who recognized injustice before it could calcify into policy. What none of them knew was that Officer Chen was also telling his own story, going home to his wife Patricia, and describing the 3 hours in the Williams' backyard with a kind of emotional hunger she hadn't heard in him in years. "They treated me like I was worth something beyond the job," he told her. "Like I was a person who could sit down and be part of something." Patricia, listening to her husband describe this evening, felt something shift in the landscape of their marriage. She'd been asking him for years to be more present, to care about their family gatherings the way he cared about his work. And now he was describing someone else's family gathering with an intensity that suggested he understood something new about what was missing. "You should call them," she said. "The Williams family, you should call and see if you could come back sometime, not as a cop, as a neighbor." Officer Chen hadn't considered this. The boundary between his professional and personal life was carefully maintained for safety reasons, and crossing it seemed like a risk. But sitting at his kitchen table at 11 p.m. with his wife, he found himself wanting to take that risk. "Maybe," he said, "maybe I will." By Sunday morning, the word had gotten around. Not through any grand announcement, but through the casual dissemination of neighborhood gossip. Karen first heard about it when her across-the-street neighbor, Margaret, mentioned casually that she'd seen a police car at the Williams place, and heard later that the officer had stayed for a party. "Apparently it was a family thing," Margaret said, delivering the information with the neutrality of someone sharing a fact while being very aware it was not neutral at all. "Your call worked out." Karen's stomach tightened. It didn't work out. He was supposed to enforce the ordinances. He fraternized with them instead. Margaret, who'd been married to an accountant for 32 years and had learned to recognize obsession when she saw it, simply nodded. "Well, that's nice, I suppose. They seem like good people." "That's not the point," Karen said. But Margaret was already leaving, and Karen realized that the narrative was slipping away from her. By Sunday evening, Karen had called the HOA president again. She requested an emergency meeting to discuss persistent neighborhood violations and lack of police enforcement response. The HOA president, Richard, a man who worked too much and cared too little about his role, agreed to a meeting on Tuesday night if we have time. Corinne spent Sunday night assembling a presentation. By Monday, Officer Chen had thought about the Williams family approximately 50 times. He'd thought about them while writing reports, while responding to a domestic violence call that had broken his heart, while directing traffic at an accident scene. The memory of that backyard, the music, the laughter, the feeling of being accepted, kept surfacing like something trying to escape from water. At 3 p.m., during a break, he texted Marcus Sr. "Hi Marcus, this is Officer Chen from the police. I hope it's okay to reach out. I really enjoyed the party Saturday. My wife Patricia and I would love to bring something and come back sometime if that would be welcome." He hit send before he could second-guess it. The response came within 2 minutes. "Officer, Patricia too. Man, we're grilling next Saturday if you want to bring your family. The kids would love to meet you." Officer Chen felt something unlock in his chest. He texted back, "We'll be there." Then he closed his eyes and allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to exist in spaces where he wasn't a symbol, where his family wasn't a representation of something, where they could just be. The HOA emergency meeting took place on Tuesday night in Richard's living room, which smelled like stale coffee and resentment for other people's time. Corinne presented her case with the precision of a prosecutor. The photographs, the sound meter readings, the municipal code references, the timeline of violations, the data suggesting that homes in neighborhoods with persistent noise disturbances depreciated at a rate of 3.7% annually. Richard listened while checking his email on his phone. "Corinne," he finally said, "I understand your concerns, but based on what you're telling me, the police assessed the situation and determined there wasn't a violation. Our authority is limited when municipal law enforcement." "They had a party," Corinne interrupted. "On a Saturday with 30 people, the officer stayed and ate food. That's not enforcement, that's fraternization." Another HOA member, Tom, cleared his throat. "Is there an actual ordinance violation we can point to?" Corinne's jaw clenched. The noise levels exceeded acceptable standards. But the police didn't cite them, because the police officer was compromised. The word hung in the air, compromised. It suggested something darker than just a noise complaint. It suggested corruption, impropriety, abuse of authority. Richard set down his phone. "Corinne, I want to be very careful here. Are you suggesting that Officer Chen made a decision based on improper influence?" Corinne understood in that moment that she'd made an error. The escalation had revealed something about her complaint that even she hadn't wanted to articulate. She didn't just think they were too loud. She thought there was something wrong with the way the officer had treated them. She thought his acceptance of their hospitality constituted some kind of breach. "I'm suggesting," she said carefully, "that the officer failed to enforce the ordinances and that normalizing noise violations creates a neighborhood culture where violations become acceptable." Tom, a retired teacher who'd spent 30 years listening to people justify themselves, nodded slowly. "So you want the HOA to formally address the noise disturbance, even though police didn't find a violation?" "Yes," Corinne said. "I want a formal letter sent to 447 Elm Street establishing that future gatherings must maintain acceptable noise levels." Richard sighed. "I can draft a letter, but Corinne, I want to be clear. If this becomes an issue where we're singling out one household, we're opening ourselves to scrutiny." "I'm not singling them out. I'm enforcing standards. Standards that were just assessed by law enforcement and found acceptable." Corinne felt her frustration spike, because the officer was compromised. "Or," Tom offered quietly, "because the officer has judgment and discretion and he used it. That's actually how the system is supposed to work." The meeting ended inconclusively, with Richard agreeing to draft a general letter about noise ordinances to all residents who'd had gatherings in the past year. This would include, he noted, the elderly couple 3 blocks over who'd hosted a retirement party, and the family on the other side of the neighborhood who'd had a graduation celebration. It was a brilliant move, Corinne realized too late. By making it general, Richard had made it impossible for her to argue that the Williams family was being singled out. And by making it go to multiple households, he diluted the impact. Corinne left the meeting feeling like she'd been outmaneuvered by people who barely cared enough to have her back. At 447 Elm Street, meanwhile, the atmosphere was one of preparation and anticipation. Officer Chen was coming back on Saturday. He was bringing his wife and his kids. This wasn't just a neighborhood nice guy gesture, this was a crossing of a line. This was a police officer in his formal capacity developing a personal relationship with the family. This was integration. Diane made a list of foods. Gloria started planning games for the kids. Zoe suggested they set up a badminton net. Marcus Jr. promised to teach Officer Chen's kids whatever sport they wanted to learn. The family understood, intuitively, that this moment meant something. That being seen as fully human by someone in a position of authority was a kind of validation they hadn't been consciously aware they needed. On Friday, Corinne received a letter from the HOA. It was addressed to all residents with recent outdoor gatherings and addressed noise ordinance guidelines in neutral, formal language. It was gentle, bureaucratic, and impossible to argue against. It arrived with carbon copies sent to 6 other households. Corinne stood in her driveway reading it 3 times, trying to find a way to feel like she'd won. She couldn't. Saturday arrived with perfect weather. Officer Chen and his family, Patricia, their daughter Emma, who was 8, and their son Marcus Jr. Same name as the Williams son, which the officer found funny, who was 11, pulled up to 447 Elm Street at 6 p.m. Corinne, who'd taken to timing her yard work to coincide with the Williams family's gatherings, watched from her driveway as Officer Chen got out of a civilian vehicle, in civilian clothes, carrying a case of beer and a potato salad his wife had made. His kids immediately ran toward the backyard, already laughing. The scene that unfolded over the next 3 hours was the opposite of what Corinne had feared. It wasn't chaos. It was celebration, yes, but it was organized, joyful, and inclusive. Officer Chen's children played badminton with the Williams kids. Patricia and Diane stood by the grill talking about schools and work and the challenges of maintaining sanity in the modern world. The officer played cards with Marcus Sr. and Gloria, laughing at her stories about the old neighborhood. The music was present but moderate. The gathering was large but not disruptive. Everything that Corinne had documented as problematic was present, and yet it had transformed into something innocent. At 8:15 p.m., when the Williams family typically wrapped up gatherings, Officer Chen made no move to leave. At 9 p.m., when other guests started departing, he was still there, his kids asleep on the porch cushions, his wife laughing at something Gloria had said. It wasn't until 10:30 p.m. that Officer Chen finally gathered his sleeping children and headed toward his car. He made eye contact with Corinne as he drove past, a deliberate acknowledgement. Not hostile, not rude, just a clear signal: I see you watching. I understand what you're doing, and I'm not going to stop coming here. Corinne called the police non-emergency line at 10:45 p.m. I want to report a noise violation occurring at 447 Elm Street. The gathering extends past acceptable hours. The music is too loud, and I want to file a formal complaint regarding Officer Chen's conduct. He was present at this gathering off-duty and consumed alcohol on the premises, which seems like a conflict of interest if the same property is under investigation for noise violations. The dispatcher, Marcus, the original one who recognized Corinne's voice immediately, took a breath. Ma'am, is there an ordinance violation occurring right now? Yes, the music, the noise, the people gathering. The music stopped at 8:15 p.m. according to my observation, and the gathering is now in the final stages of conclusion, a new voice said. Officer Chen, monitoring dispatch, had arrived at the call-out moment and decided to respond personally. This is Officer Chen. I can confirm there is no active noise violation. The gathering is compliant with ordinances. I was present in a personal capacity as a community member and guest. Corinne heard his voice and felt something break inside her. You're not supposed to. Ma'am, if you have a formal complaint about my conduct, you can file it through the precinct's Internal Affairs Department. Thank you for calling. The line went dead. Corinne didn't sleep again that night. She sat at her laptop researching file complaints against police officers. She found the department's website and read through the procedures. She began drafting a formal complaint about Officer Chen's behavior, about conflicts of interest, about favoritism, about the ways that policing should be impartial and impersonal. As she typed, she knew she was crossing a line. She was no longer complaining about noise. She was attacking the officer's professional conduct based on his choice to be human with people she'd decided were a problem. But she couldn't stop. The complaint took her until 4 a.m. to finalize. She detailed Officer Chen's unprofessional behavior, his fraternization with the subjects of a complaint, his apparent alcohol consumption while in his role as a police officer, even off-duty, his failure to properly investigate the original noise complaint. She submitted it electronically and felt a grim satisfaction at the timestamp, 4:37 a.m. on Sunday morning. Then she tried to sleep and found that her mind had transformed the complaint from a factual document into a kind of power. If she could get Officer Chen investigated, if she could get him disciplined, then the entire narrative would shift. The police would be forced to acknowledge that there had been a violation. The Williams family would be forced to acknowledge that they were in the wrong. The neighborhood would be forced to acknowledge that Karen had been right all along. Officer Chen, arriving home at 11:15 p.m., found his wife Patricia still awake, sitting in the kitchen with 2 glasses of wine poured. "How was it?" she asked. "Perfect," he said and meant it. "Emma and Marcus played the entire time. Gloria taught them how to do the step-in dance. They want to go back next week." Patricia smiled. "Then we go back next week. David, you should see yourself right now. You look happy. I haven't seen you look happy like this in years." He sat down across from her and took a sip of wine. "I think I've been living wrong," he said quietly, "working so hard to protect something I forgot to actually live in." Patricia reached across the table and took his hand. "So live in it. Go to the barbecues, bring the kids, be part of the neighborhood instead of just policing it." "Karen Chen called it in again," he said. "The noise complaint, I responded personally this time." Patricia's expression shifted. "That's going to escalate things." "I know. She's going to feel like you're taking sides." "I am taking sides," Officer Chen said simply. "I'm taking the side of people being allowed to exist happily in their own spaces, and I'm taking the side of myself, getting to be human for a couple hours instead of a symbol." Patricia nodded slowly. "Then be prepared for her to fight back. People who feel like they're losing control of their narrative tend to get desperate." Officer Chen didn't know, in that moment, that Karen had already submitted a complaint. He would find out on Monday morning when his captain called him into the office, looking uncomfortable, and told him that there had been a report filed regarding his conduct. But for now, sitting in his kitchen with his wife, feeling more at peace than he had in years, he allowed himself a moment of simple contentment. By Wednesday, Captain Martinez had officially opened an inquiry into whether Officer Chen had violated department protocols regarding impartiality and conflict of interest. The complaint, Martinez explained, involved accusations that Chen had failed to properly investigate a noise complaint due to personal relationships with the subjects, and that he'd consumed alcohol while in his role as a police officer. Even off-duty, this could be relevant to judgment. "It's probably nothing," Martinez said, but she said it in the careful way of someone who knew that nothing could easily become something, depending on how aggressive the complaint was pushed. Officer Chen read through Karen's formal complaint with a kind of stunned comprehension. She detailed everything: his arrival at the gathering, the food and beer he'd consumed, the time he'd spent there, the clear appearance of favoritism. She'd even included the municipal code sections to support her claim that his response was inadequate. She'd signed it and submitted it, turning a personal conflict into an official procedure. "She's serious," Martinez said. "She's filed this with precision. She's not some angry neighbor making noise complaints. She's made a professional allegation about your judgment and conduct." Officer Chen felt the walls of his carefully constructed professional identity beginning to shift. He'd been a cop for 16 years. He'd never had a complaint filed against him. His record was clean. And now, because he'd accepted a plate of food and stayed for a party, that record was compromised. "What happens next?" he asked. "We investigate, we talk to you, we talk to witnesses. We determine whether protocol was violated, standard internal affairs procedure. And if it's determined that I was, then we'll address it. Suspension, possible termination depending on severity. But Chen, between you and me," Martinez leaned back in her chair, "this seems like a neighbor who's upset about a noise complaint that didn't result in a citation. That's not usually grounds for professional discipline." But, but optics matter. If it looks like you're favoring certain neighborhoods over others, that's a problem. If it looks like you're using your position to socialize with subjects of complaints, that's a problem. And right now, even if nothing technically wrong happened, it looks like something is off. Officer Chen left the office feeling like he was inside a box, and the walls were closing in slowly enough that he could watch it happen. At 447 Elm Street, they learned about the complaint when Officer Chen, feeling that transparency was the only path forward, told them himself. "There's been a complaint filed about my conduct," he explained to Marcus S.R. and Diane. "It's under investigation. I wanted you to know because it might affect my ability to spend time here. I wanted you to know that this wasn't your fault, that you didn't do anything wrong." Diane felt something cold crystallize in her chest. "Karen," she said, it wasn't a question. "I can't confirm or deny specific complainants," Officer Chen said, falling into official language despite his intention to be personal. "But yes, it's Karen Chen from across the street." Marcus S.R. stood up and walked to the window, looking at Karen's house across the street. "That woman has been looking at us since we moved in," he said quietly, "like we were something that needed to be managed." "I'm sorry," Officer Chen said. "I should have been smarter about this. I shouldn't have." "No," Diane interrupted. "We're glad you came. We're glad you let yourself be human. That's not a problem. Her problem is her problem." But they all understood that problems, once formalized, became everyone's problem. By Friday, the Williams family's attorney, a sharp woman named Keisha who specialized in civil rights cases, had been consulted. "This is textbook harassment," Keisha explained, sitting in their living room with her laptop. "She's filing a complaint about a police officer's conduct to suppress your ability to gather. That's retaliation. That's using official channels to enforce her preferred neighborhood behavior." "Can we do anything?" Diane asked. "We can file a counter-complaint about the pattern of surveillance. We can document the times she's photographed your property, recorded noise levels. We can demonstrate that this is part of a sustained campaign to intimidate you into conforming to her standards of neighborhood life." Marcus S.R. shook his head. "I don't want to do that. I don't want to turn this into some kind of legal war." "Then what do you want?" "I want to have barbecues," Marcus said simply. "I want my family to gather in my backyard. I want my kids to grow up knowing they're welcome in their own home. But I don't want to become an example of something. I don't want to spend years fighting." Keisha nodded slowly. "Then the question becomes, what's Karen's endgame? Is she trying to stop you from gathering? Is she trying to get Officer Chen disciplined? Is she trying to make life difficult enough that you move?" None of them had an answer. Karen, meanwhile, was waiting. She'd filed the complaint. Now the process was supposed to work. The investigation would determine that Officer Chen had violated protocol. He would face discipline. Word would get out that he'd been reprimanded. And that would send a message to the Williams family. The neighborhood had standards, and those standards would be enforced. But the investigation wasn't moving as quickly as she'd hoped. By the following Tuesday, a full week after submitting her complaint, she hadn't heard anything. She called the precinct's non-emergency line and asked to speak to Captain Martinez. She was told that investigations take time and that she would be notified of the outcome. "I just want to make sure the investigation is moving forward," Karen said carefully. "All investigations move at their own pace, ma'am. We don't disclose timelines or details." Karen hung up and called Margaret across the street. Margaret, who'd always been friendly in a superficial way, suddenly had less time to chat. Their conversation lasted 90 seconds before Margaret excused herself. Karen called Richard, the HOA president. Richard was evasive. "The general noise letter went out," he said. "I think we've addressed the issue appropriately." "But the officer's conduct—" "Karen, I think it's best if we let law enforcement handle their own internal matters. That's not really HOA jurisdiction." Karen felt herself being quietly isolated from the neighborhood structure she'd spent so long trying to control. On Wednesday evening, she decided to take a different approach. She drove to the local news station and requested a meeting with one of the reporters she'd seen covering neighborhood stories. The reporter, a woman named Jessica who was always looking for human interest stories, agreed to meet. Karen brought her documentation, the photographs, the ordinance violations, the sound meter readings, and the narrative, A family moving into a quiet neighborhood, immediately disrespecting the established peace, with a police officer failing to enforce ordinances apparently due to personal relationships. It's about neighborhood integrity, Karen explained. It's about standards. It's about the police treating everyone equally regardless of personal connections. Jessica listened and took notes, but her expression remained professionally neutral. "Have you spoke with the family directly?" she asked. "About what? About their noise? About their gathering? About what these parties mean to them?" Karen felt something defensive rise in her. "I shouldn't have to speak to them. The ordinances speak for themselves." "The ordinances do speak for themselves," Jessica said. "But so do people, and you know the police apparently didn't find a violation. That's a fact too." Karen's frustration spiked, because the officer was compromised. "According to your complaint, but that's under investigation. Until that investigation concludes, it's an allegation." Karen left the meeting understanding that Jessica wasn't going to be her vehicle for narrative control. The reporter was too experienced to take one side without examining the other. That same Wednesday, Officer Chen and his family went back to the Williams house. He arrived in civilian clothes, unarmed, his family beside him. It was the same gathering, the same backyard, the same music, but it felt different now, weighted with the knowledge that his presence here was being officially scrutinized. Patricia could see the tension in his shoulders. "Stop thinking about the complaint," she said quietly as they walked toward the backyard. "Just be here." But being there had become complicated, in a way that going to family barbecues shouldn't require. Gloria, seeing him arrive, grabbed his hand. "Don't let her steal your joy," the older woman said firmly. "Whatever that woman is trying to do, don't let her steal this." Officer Chen nodded, but the damage was partly done. The certainty of his simple actions, going to a party, eating food, being human, had been questioned officially. And once something was questioned officially, it could never feel as simple again. The investigation into Officer Chen concluded on a Thursday morning, and the conclusion was, no violation found. Captain Martinez called him into her office and explained that after reviewing the conduct, interviewing witnesses, and examining the protocols, she determined that Officer Chen had acted within his authority and discretion. Responding to a call, assessing the situation, determining no violation, and then socializing as a private citizen was not a violation of department policy. "The complaint will remain on file," Martinez said, "but it's being closed as unfounded. You're cleared." Officer Chen felt relief, but it was incomplete relief. The complaint had been filed. It would remain on file. It would appear in background checks and employment reviews, a marker of suspicion, even if the suspicion had been officially discredited. "Thank you," he said. "You should probably be a little more careful about the appearance of things going forward," Martinez added. "I know it shouldn't matter, but it does. People notice when you're friendly with people you've responded to. Even if the friendliness is personal and separate from your official capacity, people notice." It was a soft warning, delivered with sympathy but with teeth. Karen learned about the outcome not through official channels, but through Margaret, who'd heard from Diane, who'd heard from Officer Chen. The complaint had been found unfounded. He'd been cleared. Karen sat in her kitchen, staring at her laptop, and felt something inside her collapse. The complaint that had taken her until 4 a.m. to perfect had been dismissed. The investigation that should have vindicated her had instead validated Officer Chen. Worse, by filing the complaint, she'd made herself the villain of the story. She was the woman who'd called the police, and when the police hadn't sided with her, she'd filed a complaint against the officer for refusing to enforce her preferences. She realized, the problem. The neighborhood's perception of Karen Chen shifted after that. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was the slow, cumulative adjustment of how people responded to her. Margaret started giving one-word answers to conversation starters. Richard stopped making eye contact at HOA meetings. The woman at the grocery store who'd always smiled at her stopped smiling. Karen noticed all of it and understood exactly why it was happening. She'd made Officer Chen an enemy, and Officer Chen was well-liked. She'd tried to suppress a family's joy, and that family had done nothing wrong. She'd used official channels to enforce her personal preferences, and those preferences had been rejected by the system itself. By Thursday of that week, Karen decided she needed to apologize. She prepared it for 3 days. The words had to be exactly right. They had to acknowledge wrongdoing without seeming performative. They had to be sincere without being pathetic. She practiced them in front of her mirror, spoke them aloud in her car, rewrote them multiple times. On Sunday at 3 p.m., she walked across the street to 447 Elm Street and knocked on the door. Diane opened it, and her face immediately became carefully neutral. "Hi," Corinne said. Her voice sounded strange, thick. "I was wondering if I could talk to Marcus and you, and Officer Chen if he's here." Diane didn't invite her inside. She left Corinne on the porch while she went to get her husband. They stood together, blocking the doorway, waiting to hear what Corinne had to say. Officer Chen wasn't there that day. It was just Marcus, Diane, and Corinne, and the gap between their front porch and her own across the street, which suddenly felt very wide. "I owe you an apology," Corinne said. "I was wrong. I filed a complaint against Officer Chen that was unfair. I've been watching your house. I've been hostile, and I was wrong." Marcus and Diane said nothing. "The noise complaints weren't really about the noise," Corinne continued. "I didn't like that you moved in. I didn't like that you were different, and I turned that discomfort into these rules and regulations. That wasn't fair to you." Diane's expression softened slightly. "No, it wasn't." "I'm sorry," Corinne said. "I genuinely am. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I understand what I did, and I'm sorry." There was a long silence. Then Marcus said, "Apology accepted, but we're not going to stop gathering. We're not going to stop having parties. That's our home, and we're going to use it." "I know," Corinne said. "You should." Diane asked, "Will you continue to complain to the HOA? Will you continue the conflict?" "No," Corinne said. "I'm done. And if we're loud sometimes, if we have people over, then I'll remember that you're allowed to," Corinne said. That's normal. That joy isn't a violation." She turned to leave, and Diane said, "Wait, do you want to come inside? We have some iced tea, and if you want, next Saturday we're having a small gathering, just a few people. You're welcome." Corinne felt something inside her shift. She wasn't sure if she could accept, wasn't sure if she was ready to step into the space she'd been fighting so hard against. But she said, "Okay, yes, I'd like that." The next Saturday, Corinne stood in the Williams' backyard for the first time. It was strange. Everything looked different from inside the fence than it did from across the street. The space seemed smaller, more intimate. The people seemed less threatening and more human. The music seemed less like an assault on the neighborhood and more like the simple expression of people existing together. Officer Chen was there too, with his family. When he saw Corinne, he nodded, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement, a willingness to move forward. Gloria came over with 2 glasses of lemonade and handed one to Corinne. "Come on, baby," she said. "Let me teach you the step and dance. You move like someone who's been holding themselves too tight for too long." Corinne spent the afternoon learning dance moves from an 87-year-old woman, laughing at herself, and beginning to understand that the neighborhood she'd tried so hard to preserve had been preserved exactly right all along. It just required her to participate in it differently. The HOA meeting the following Tuesday was marked by the note that Corinne submitted. She wanted the General Noise Ordinance letter rescinded, as she determined her previous concerns had been based on personal misunderstanding rather than actual violations. Richard, clearly relieved, agreed. The letter was rescinded. No official action was taken against the Williams family. Officer Chen remained on the force, cleared of the complaint, and Corinne began the slow process of becoming a neighbor instead of a sentinel. The Williams family continued their gatherings, but with slightly more awareness of their environment. Occasionally, if they thought a gathering might run late, Diane would preemptively email Corinne, asking if she minded if they kept music going until 10 p.m. Corinne always responded yes. The other neighbors, noticing that Corinne had apparently accepted the reality of living near a family that enjoyed celebration, began to relax as well. Margaret and Diane became genuine friends, bonding over their kids' school situation. Tom, the retired teacher, started coming to the gatherings himself, telling Marcus Sr. stories about teaching English while the man grilled. Officer Chen and his family came back every Saturday, sometimes just for an hour, sometimes for the whole evening. His kids were now part of the regular rotation of children playing in the Williams' backyard, and Patricia had developed a genuine friendship with Diane that existed independent of their husband's connection. But the real shift came in late July, when Karen organized a block party. She did it as an act of what might be called contrition, or might be called genuine neighborly spirit. She wasn't sure herself which motivated her more. She invited everyone on Elm Street and the surrounding blocks. She asked different families to bring dishes. And when the day came, she set up tables in her own driveway and created a space that belonged to all of them. Officer Chen grilled alongside Marcus. Karen and Patricia discussed books. Gloria taught a group of neighborhood kids the step and dance, and even Karen's usually carefully controlled yard filled with laughter and music and the sound of people existing together. The neighborhood came together not because someone had forced them, not because someone had filed a complaint or created conflict, but because someone had finally allowed it. 3 months later, at the annual neighborhood council meeting, Richard announced that complaints were down, neighborhood satisfaction was up, and he'd never seen the HOA work better. He attributed it to the new community engagement initiatives, which Karen had spearheaded after her revelation. Karen, sitting in the back of the room, understood that she'd accidentally created something good by finally giving up the thing she'd been fighting for: control. The Williams family, sitting a few rows ahead, turned to smile at her. Officer Chen, present in an unofficial capacity, raised his beer in a toast. To Karen, to the neighborhood, to the idea that sometimes the best enforcement of community standards wasn't punishment but participation. A year later, when Karen's house went on the market, she decided to move to be closer to her aging parents. The Williams family came to her farewell party. It wasn't ironic, it was redemption. She'd learned that you couldn't preserve a neighborhood by trying to control who lived in it. You could only preserve it by learning to live alongside the people in it, even, especially, the ones who were different from you. As she packed her boxes, she thought about all the hours she'd spent watching that backyard, documenting violations, trying to enforce a vision of neighborhood life that required everyone to be as cautious and controlled as she was. And she thought about how much better it felt to simply participate. Officer Chen's complaint file was eventually purged after 3 years, the standard protocol for unfounded allegations. But the memory of it remained, not as a scar, but as a reminder of something he'd learned. That using his power as a police officer to enforce every rule created a very different neighborhood than using his power to bring people together. He would eventually become an advocate within the police department for community engagement initiatives, for officers spending time in neighborhoods not as enforcers but as neighbors, for recognizing that sometimes the best policing wasn't prevention but participation. The Williams family continued their Saturday gatherings. They expanded, eventually including neighbors from 3 blocks away. Gloria lived to be 93, and her step and dance became a neighborhood institution. And Karen, in her new city, found herself calling Diane sometimes, staying connected to the place she'd almost destroyed with her fear of change. She'd learned, finally, what the officer had known all along: that joy doesn't diminish property values, that community doesn't destroy neighborhoods, that the real threats to a neighborhood's survival aren't the families that gather and laugh too loud, they're the ones that forget how to gather at all.